Hello guys, welcome to Adlit Lessons. Today we shall have a look at fallacies of traditional grammar. What do you mean by fallacies? Faults, flaws, errors, mistakes, weaknesses. Fallacies mean mistakes, errors, flaws, and faults. So, fallacies of traditional grammar deals with what are the weaknesses, the errors, the mistakes, or what are the flaws within traditional grammar. In simple terms, what are the demerits of traditional grammar? When linguistics began to develop in the early decades of the 20th century, there was a natural and reasonable reaction against much of the traditional study, of course. So traditional grammar became, or it had to confront scrutiny. So it was when the new phase of modern structuralism, modern linguistics, it gains momentum that people, structuralists, linguists, and grammarians, they take a look back. They were taking a look back at the traditional grammar, and then they were trying to pick out the demerits and the flaws and faults in traditional grammar. To find the fallacies of traditional grammar, it's important to understand what constitutes traditional grammar, because there is no such thing called a single homogeneous traditional approach, either to grammar or anything else in language study, because language is evolving, it is becoming. So it is subjected to changes, and you can't simply suggest or insist and impose one particular singular traditional approach, which is homogeneous. The phrase traditional grammar attempts to summarize all the different methods and principles used in different combinations by many schools of thought. So there are ideas about sentence structure deriving from the earliest, that is, from Aristotle and Plato, and ideas about parts of speech. What are parts of speech? Nouns, pronouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, conjunctions, interjections, and even articles. So, ideas about parts of speech deriving from the Stoic grammarians, very old classical grammarians. Ideas about nature of meaning, semantics, from the scholastic debates of Middle Ages. So it's a tracing back, ideas about relationship between language and mind from the 17th century philosophical controversy. You had rationalists, empiricists, you had the 18th century grammars of English, and ideas about history of language deriving from the 19th century, emphasis on comparative philology. In the previous video lessons, I hope you might be remembering that you heard about philology, that's the study of language in the olden days, in the classical past. It was referred to as philology before or prior to the emerging of linguistics. So the Greeks, they were the ones who initiated so many lines of thought about language. And of course, you know the term grammatike, which implied understanding the use of letters. So that is having the skill of reading and writing. Now, so these theories and these principles of the long past were taken over by the Romans with very little change in general principle, and through the influence of Latin on Europe was introduced in different degrees into every grammatical handbook written before the 20th century, and teaching of Latin grammar and study of Latin literature. These were the most important aspects in the history of language study for promoting uh, development of misleading principles of analysis in traditional grammars, because you can just imagine how Latin grammar and Latin literature, how the rules and general principles underlying these language and these grammars and literature, how can that be borrowed from Latin language and then is imposed and it has been insisted on English language. So it's really a desperate situation. The assumption was that there was one common or universal grammar underlying the structure of all languages, which was based not on language form but on the laws of reason. So you can see the 18th century English grammars, they were really the authors, the literature, the grammar, everything, it was steeped into Latinate and literary traditions, producing rules of correctness and incorrectness. So grammars and rules and theories of one particular language is taken and applied to another language. So in this case, every language structure really suffered. English language suffered a lot under these misleading and misinterpretations and applying the weight, the burden of another language rules. So the structuralists, it was the structuralists who were the ones who reacted against the approaching traditional school of grammars. The failings, the demerits or fallacies of traditional as enumerated by them are the following. You have 10 important fallacies which you are supposed to give prime importance, because we need to know the demerits and fallacies of traditional grammar in order to have very authentic foundational knowledge in modern linguistics. So here comes the first one, the Latinate fallacy. This notion was that the Latin language was superior to the vernaculars. Vernaculars is the local language, the English. It had a perfect grammar, and English grammar should be described in terms of Latin. How awkward. As for example, sentences which end in a preposition are quite normal in English, but traditional grammarians condemned such usage because they objected to ending sentences with a preposition. For example, this is the pen I write with. This is the pen I write with. With is, of course, a preposition, but in Latin, you don't have sentence constructions where a sentence ends in preposition. So of course, traditional grammarians, they never obliged or they were never favorable of using prepositions at the end of a sentence. And Latin is a highly inflected language with grammatical markers for number, gender, etc. But English is largely uninflected one when compared to Latin, which meaning is mainly structure dependent, because in Latin, nouns, they have six different forms, whereas English have only two case forms. Okay, the neutral or common and the possessive. Okay, for example, John, and it's in the case of possessive, it's John's bag. So these are the two case forms, whereas in Latin, a noun is having six different forms. So it is quite absurd and awkward to impose the grammar of one language being imposed on another language. And that is what you call as the Latinate fallacy. The semantic fallacy, of course, the title itself will give you implications that it's related to meaning, of course. So the definitions of many parts of speech, they were based on meaning. A noun is a name of a person, thing, idea, or place. Of course, and a verb means an action. Adjective is a word which describes nouns. Adverbs, they describes and modifies verbs. And prepositions, they show position, etc. And this was objected to by structuralists. So this is also another fallacy. How can you define parts of speech with respect to meaning? Sometimes this meaning is objective because meaning is objective verifiable. Structuralists, they object to this because meaning is not objectively verifiable. Noun is defined as the name of a person, place, or thing. But for example, I shall give you an example, that is a brick house. In the example, brick house, brick is in fact an adjective. Yes. But brick is in fact, so it shows a house which is made up of bricks, and brick is functioning as an adjective. But when you take brick as a separate word, it is a noun. So how can you say that? How can you say that parts of speech, they are defined in terms of meaning. So, according to structuralist meanings, they are not objectively verifiable. An interrogative sentence is defined as one that asks a question, but it's not necessary. Sometimes you have rhetorical questions. All interrogative sentences should be, it is not necessary that every interrogative sentences should be questions. But all questions need not be interrogative. So this depends upon defining the word clauses, okay, and categorizing the grammatical categories of words. So that is it. Then comes the next fallacy, which is called mixing up different criteria. All the traditional definitions, they were not based on meaning. Some were defined in terms of meaning, some were defined in terms of function, and some on form. The use of such different criteria for classification makes it difficult to decide which clause a word belongs. Just like I told you the previous example, brick house. Brick is an adjective, it modifies a noun, but at the same time it's a noun. So structuralists found itself different criteria. Sometimes words they are defined in terms of meaning, sometimes they are defined on function, and sometimes on their form. This is not proper because here different criteria are mixed up in confusion persists. So structuralists found it unscientific to mix up criteria. So that is it. And then comes the normative fallacy. Traditional grammarians, they were preoccupied with the prescription. Of course, we have learned the definitions of traditional grammar, which prescribes rules and norms or standards standards of usage. Too much importance is given to the do's and do nots, which is correct, which is not correct. This is you should use it this way, you shouldn't use this way. Do's and do nots always they do neglect, they don't consider the actual usage of language. Since norms of correctness were prescribed, they were referred to as normative grammar. So the norms are prescribed before considering or analyzing the actual usage of people. I told you in the previous video lessons, you have listened to me saying that grammar or language is a matter which has to be described and defined in terms of the natives of a language community, not rules and not norms and conventions. It's really improper to devise or design rules and then impose it upon, because language, it's fluid, it's always in a state of flux, it keeps on changing constantly. So a language gets enriched and polished and its vocabulary becomes massive and larger, it grows every hour, every now and then, only if it welcomes convincing and reasonable proper changes. So language being subjected to change, strict adherence to rules and norms will be to ignore the reality of linguistic changes. I hope you remember David Crystal saying that uh, in the near future you will have a sack full of different Englishes. So that's a condition of languages. And then comes the next fallacy. Again, it is similar to the previous ones. A grammar that prescribes the rigid rules rather than considering the actual usage of language by the natives of a language community, the users of a language. Um, it is called a prescriptive grammar, and traditional grammars, they tended to be prescriptive in nature. So structuralists, they are never for prescriptive kind. They are always bothered about the descriptive nature of grammar. Grammar should be something which has to be deduced, deduced from the actual usages, the daily conversations, how socially, culturally, politically, how it is used, what are the contemporary conventions underlying a society, a culture. So all these are important factors in determining the correctness of a language, and it should be descriptive. Listen, analyze, observe the different usages of languages It should have some connection with the culture. It's within every culture, within every society and state. Grammarians and linguists, they have to take into consideration different multiple pluralities of language usages, and they should describe a grammar which actually defines the usage rather than prescribing and imposing rules. Here comes the next fallacy, the logical fallacy. It refers to the false faith in the existence of laws universally applicable to all languages. Languages, they do not work with the mechanism of a set of a universally, that's what I told you, valid rules. You don't have a set of a complete, absolute, rigid rules, which is applicable to all languages. Every language has its own system of rules, and it is absurd to expect all languages to behave alike. Every language is distinct, unique, and has its own norms and conventions. They do vary in grammatical categories and in other features too. For instance, English has got two tenses, the past tense and the present tense, while Malayalam has got three tenses, past, present, and future. The statement that English has three tenses is an instance of logical fallacy. For example, in the sentence, I will sing, the verb is in the present tense with the future time reference. With traditional grammarians, they refer to I will sing as a future tense. So, this is what you call the logical fallacy. You cannot expect every languages to follow same rules. That's it. Yes. Then comes another kind of fallacy or failing or demerit. Explicit statements are those which are clearly and unambiguously stated. So traditional grammars, they lacked explicitness with regard to linguistic description. So it was structuralists who made explicit statements which could be easily tested and proved. There was no explicitness in traditional grammars. You know, everything that they define, everything that they describe, they were, as we have already seen, the criterion and the logic, everything is mixed up. So it was structuralists who gave clarity and coherence to statements and rules and theories which they described in terms of people, the users of a language. Then the next fallacy is that the spoken form was considered as a corrupt representation. More importance or unnecessary, irrelevant importance was given to the written form of language. Traditionalists, they give too much importance to written form of language, and they wrote grammars based on the written form. They considered it the correct language form. The spoken form was just what you say, an imperfect representation of the written form. And structuralists, they stressed the primacy of speech because speech is important. You speak first and only then you write. This is what the structuralists believe. So that is the neglect of the spoken form, where writing dominates speech or speaking. Okay, so old traditional grammarians, they were always favoring the writing, the graphic or the written form of a language rather than spoken form. Yes, the traditionalists, they regarded only the language of great literature worth studying. They ignored the synchronic variations of dialect, register, etc. We shall have a much closer look at dialect, idiolect, register, pidgin, creole, etc. in the upcoming video lessons. There are different dialects in every languages. For example, we our native language is Malayalam, of course, and in inside within Kerala, within the state itself, we have different varieties of Malayalam, and we do have often hilarious conversations and comments and jokes regarding that too. Dialectical forms were looked down as bad English, inferior in quality. So the literature or the writing style, the language form which was used by the great authors and great literary traditions, they were looked up as a perfect form. That's why this fallacy is called ignoring the language variations. Every language has got its own variations, as dialects are there. depends upon the geographical spaces. It's based on that, it's geography bound. And of course, every language has got different varieties of the same thing. And the scientific structural approach takes all these varieties into consideration and objectively describes them. Traditionalists, they ignored, they never valued, or they never considered the changes that took place in within a language. They never accepted dialect. They never accepted colloquial languages and conversational styles. And the last one is the historical fallacy, where the traditionalists, they ignored the historical changes and they considered them as corrupting influence on language and tried to preserve its purity. They looked upon the language of past masters. So, ignoring the language variation and historical fallacy, they resemble, that is the old classical texts where the perfect embodiments of perfect language, they were exemplary in using the perfect language. Modern text and new usages of language is often considered as crude, corrupted, and imperfect. So it's mandatory, or traditional grammarians, they suggest that it's important and imperative to preserve the purity of language, to preserve the old texts. They looked upon the language of past masters as model for present day English. This can never happen because language, society, time is moving on and on. Since language is subjected to change, the grammarian, he should describe contemporary usage. He should listen to what people are saying. He should take into consideration various factors which impact, which affect and influence languages, the social incidents, the political issues, what all are happening with what all internal and external happenings and incidents are taking place within a society, directly or indirectly impacts a lot upon the growth and enrichment and changes and variations that take place within a language, which a grammarian or a linguist must take into consideration. Standards of usage should be based on contemporary criteria and not on what had been written down long ago. So, a linguist is aware that the grammarian of a language does not make the rules of that language. A grammarian cannot do this, and he should not do that. That is, a linguist is aware that the grammarian of language, he should make the rules of that language. A grammarian cannot do this, and he shouldn't do that. He should restrict his ambitions to codifying and explaining what is already there. People are there. People who use the languages are there. Of course, today it's we are in the midst of a pandemic, and you know how much new words, how much your language, your communication style, your text messages, your comments, your jokes, your statuses, your updates, everything has changed a lot. So the usage of the people should be taken into consideration who speak the language. If a grammarian tries to overreach himself, he will lose, of course, and his rules will be overruled by the weight of majority usage. If this differs from what he prescribes, and people will ignore his prescriptions when using their language unself-consciously. So this is what happened in the case of traditional grammarians and prescriptive traditional grammar, because the grammarian tried to overreach himself, and if this differs, his rules, if they differs from what he prescribes, people will never take it into consideration because they are using language, and its practical reality that so many changes, social life, cultural life, ethnic life, natural disasters, wars, violence, epidemics, pandemics, and whatnot. The administrative incidents, what is happening in politics, what's happening in the financial sector, what's happening in geography, what's happening in agriculture, what's happening in capitalism, the finance sector, the capitalist realms, what's happening in education, what's happening in all the realms of a society and culture, what is actually happening. All these must be taken into consideration by a grammarian before describing and defining the rules and theories underlying a particular language. Thank you guys. Thank you for watching and listening. See you the next time, the next video lesson.